Today's daf we're going to learn is Nazir Daf Menbab. Today's daf is sponsored by Rachel Savin in memory of her father Shalom ben Shmuel on his first year at site, and also for a shlema for those injured in last night's attack. Okay, we are going to get started with the Mishnah. Review of the Mishnah on Memhe Amud Bet at the bottom. Hayam mevashel et hashlamim o shalkan. We're now at the end of the process. What the Nazir does after bringing his sacrifices, he takes this rob shelai, he takes this limb from the ayil, from the ram, this older sheep. So we take one of the loaves of each of the sets of loaves, and they do this waving action. That's what our main topic is going to be today. How critical is this waving action? And then only after that whole process can the Nazir drink wine. Where does this come from? And become impure to dead, meaning your Nizirut is over at this point. So the pasuk, it comes from the simple reading of the pasuk. It says there, okay, after the end of all the description of the sacrifices, if you open your Chumash Bamidbar chapter 6, verse 20, okay, so the Kohen now does this waving. That's in addition to other parts the Kohen gets. And then the Nazir gets to drink wine. So it sounds very clear that after this happens, the Nazir can now drink wine. You need everything, all those steps before, in order to permit the Nazir to drink wine. Which means that Rabbi Shimon's approach, which we already saw last time, but we'll see now at the beginning of our daf, is a little bit complicated. Where does he get this from? Rabbi Shimon Omer, it's only one blood of one sacrifice being sprinkled on the altar, meaning the finishing of one sacrifice, one complete sacrifice. That is sufficient, and then the Nazir is permitting. So really, we're going to have to question, where does he get his approach from? So we're going to start in the Gemara with, first, they bring a Braita, which, as we've seen many of these Braita quoted by the Gemara, are very similar to the Mishnah, but they add one important element, which is what's their basis in the verses, in a style of a Midrash Halakha as opposed to style of a Mishnah. Style of a Mishnah is, let's just give the halachot. Style of a Midrash Halakha is more, let's connect the halachot to the psukim. So the first thing they do is connect the first opinion, as we saw, to the pasuk, Achar Yishtan Azil Yain, Achar Hamaasim Kulam, which means after all of these things are done, again, simple reading of the text. Divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Now we see something interesting, which is that Rabbi Eliezer is the first Tana in our Mishnah. Normally, there's an unnamed Tana. Usually, it's the opinion of the rabbis. But now we start learning that this unattributed opinion called Tanakama, the first Tanaitic opinion in the Mishnah that came without a name, is actually Rabbi Eliezer's opinion. And the rabbis, Chachamim Omrim, actually like Rabbi Shimon. Achal Ma'aseh Yechidi. The rabbis say it's after one unique action. So now, often the unattributed Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, but that's usually different. That's when the unattributed opinion in the Mishnah is Rabbi Meir, when you only have one opinion. We usually assume it's Rabbi Meir, but again, that's an assumption that often could be broken if we know it happens to be somebody else. But usually when it's just Tanakama arguing with someone and it doesn't have a name, it's not necessarily Rabbi Meir. So now the rabbis say it's usually the majority opinion. So now we want to know my Tama Rabbanan, which is also what's the reason for Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. Why do they say one? Because that's really the answer, the opinion that's not so clear cut. And now we're going to have a bit of a complicated Gzeira Shava, only complicated because we're going to compare two words that are used in very different ways in each verse, but yet we're going to make a Gzeira Shava, what's called, which is, if you remember, you always have to have a tradition about Gzeira Shava, which is going to play an important factor in this sugya. And we're going to say what we're going to see how this Gzeira Shava works. Without our introduction, we'll start. So that's our pasuk. We already know that pasuk. Uchtiv hatam, and it says there, achal hitgalcho et nizro. So where is there? There is actually the pasuk right before. The pasuk right before says, okay, it's basically our Mishnah, right? The description of what our Mishnah says. You take the zra first, because the pasuk we just read was the hanafa, when you start waving it. Here it says you take the zra from the ayil, you take the chala matzah achad, you take all those parts, and then it says you put it on the kapeh Nazir, on the hands of the Nazir. Achal hitgalcho et nizro. after he already did the shaving of his Nazirut. Now, we're going to compare this achar, after he already did the shaving, to the achar yishta Nazir yayin. And after this, the Nazir could drink wine. The problem with this comparison is that after he shaves is not used in the same way as after all the things we just said, the Nazir gets to drink wine. You follow the difference? It's a very different usage of the word after. The first one is after, the first one meaning the one that comes earlier in the pasuk. After he shaves, he can, right? This is when he's supposed to do all this. This comes after something else. And the other after is kind of saying, this is before something else that gets to happen in the future, which is, oh, now the Nazir can go and drink wine. So in any case, they bring Gzera Shava. How does it work? Mahatam achar maaseh yichidi. Now the achar that we said is, okay, that's helpful, Ruth, thank you. It's a connection rather than a description. Okay, right? The first is a description and this is a connection. So now that you did this, that moves to the next. So now we have the following. When it says achar hitgalchot nizro, the word achar, because really for the Gzera Shava purposes, we don't care how the words being used in the pasuk. The point is the word achal is connected with what? Hitgalchot nizro, after he shaved his hair, which means shaving hair is one action. So there you have, just like that, it's achar goes with maaseh yichidi, av kan achar maaseh yichidi. Likewise here, it's going to be all based on one action. Achar yishta Nazir yayin, after only one action. So again, it's a hard one to wrap your head around in terms of logic, but it's not logical. It's a Gzera Shava. Gzera Shavas aren't meant to be logical. So now the Gemara says, Ema adi ikat. Why don't we say, as you could still say, maybe you need both parts. Maybe you need the sacrifices and the shaving, because even acharit galchot nizro is actually, what does it say? You do the tnufa when? After it galchot nizro, but it happens to also be after you finish the sacrifices. So maybe there it means two and here it means two, and maybe it's basically saying that was done after the whole process, and this is also done after the entire process is finished. The sacrifices, the shaving, everything, which would then go against. So they say, Ema adi ikat. Maybe it means until you need both the tiglachat and the sacrifices, just like right when the both sukkim were really referring to, right, after he shaved and did all the sacrifices, and therefore maybe here also, after you shave, after you do all the sacrifices, maybe only then it's permitted. To which the Gemara says, but then we'd have no need for Gzera Shava, because that's the simple reading of the verses. And this is why I say it's going to come into play, this idea of tradition. We have a tradition that there's a Gzera Shava here, which means that there must be something it's coming to teach you. If it's coming to teach you, this comes after the whole process is done. Well, that's the simple reading of the psukim. You don't need a Gzera Shava for that. And therefore, it must be coming to teach you. Only one sacrifice is enough against the simple reading of the text. Okay, so far what we've done is we gave the reason for the first opinion, the Tanakhama's opinion, which is Rabbi Eliezer, that it's achar maasim kulam, and that's just the simple reading. And then we had Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis who learned it all from Gzera Shava, achar achar, hitgalchot yayin. There it's only one action, therefore here it will be only one action. Obviously, they're saying it doesn't have to be the same action because our one action is sacrifice. For there it was shaving. Now we're going to get into a more complicated section of today's talk. Amarav, shnufa benazir ma'akev. Now comes Rav, and he says the tnufa is an essential part of the process. If you don't do the tnufa, you're not going to be able to drink the wine. You can't now. You're still a Nazir basically. If for some reason you didn't do the waving, okay, the tnufa is the waving of these things together, you're still a Nazir. Okay, this is taking the shita of the rat, right? Well, we're going to see actually what this is all about. Okay, so let's wait for a minute. Aliba Daman. Okay, we're going to have two versions of the sugya now. This is version one. Version one is that Rav says shnufa b'nazir is ma'akevet. It's a critical element. You don't do it, you're still a Nazir. Aliba Daman. According to, does this go? If you're going to say like the rabbis who said even after one sacrifice it's enough, obviously you can't say that the waving is going to be critical and you won't be able to drink wine anymore. You'll still be a Nazir forever, because the rabbis think that the shaving isn't an important essential element, because they said as long as you sprinkle the blood of one sacrifice, you're fine. So tenufa mebaya, of course they're not going to think that waving, right? Waving is generally not considered a critical element of the sacrifice. So, of course, you're not going to even have a question about waving. So it certainly doesn't match the rabbis. Ella, I'll leave it to Rabbi Eliezer. If he holds like Rabbi Eliezer, then, which makes a lot of sense, Rabbi Eliezer says, after all of these actions, which would then include Snufa. But we still have a question on that, because Pshita, we don't need Rav to tell us something that's very obvious. Now, what did Rabbi Eliezer say? Hama Rabbi Eliezer, achar ma'asim kulam. Rabbi Eliezer said it's after all the actions that the Nazir did. And it even comes in the pasuk with the waving. So it must mean, Rabbi Eliezer, it's obvious Rabbi Eliezer says this. Now, Rav, who's an Amora, wouldn't come and say something that was obvious that Rabbi Eliezer said. If he wanted to do that, he would have just said, halakha ke Rabbi Eliezer. And then we would have known, shnufa is ma'akevet. So it also doesn't make sense to say that he holds like Rabbi Eliezer. So now we're stuck. Who does he hold like? To which the Gemara brings an answer. Well, really it is Rabbi Eliezer. Now, the one good method of answering a pshita is saying why it wouldn't be so obvious and why you might have thought to say something else. Ma'u detema, you might have thought, kevandali inyan kapara, shayarei mitzvahi, hachanami lo ta'akev. When it comes to most sacrifices or mincha offerings or any time where you have a waving action, which comes up in a whole bunch of different sacrifices, it's called shiarei mitzvah. Shiarei literally means the remainder. It means it's not an essential part of the mitzvah. If you don't do it, it doesn't prevent the korban. Usually you need to do the sprinkling of the blood. That's the main part. Once you do that, it's fine. Nothing else is really critical. So you might have thought that maybe it's not ma'akev here. And it comes to teach you, even though normally hanafa is not a critical element, you might have thought, when Rabbi Eliezer said after all these actions, you might have said, kind of like we said, you need the sacrifices, you need the shaving, but nobody ever said you need the tnufa. Maybe the tnufa isn't essential. Comes Rav and says, according to Rabbi Eliezer, even the tnufa is essential. You must do this waving action. You didn't do it, you're still a Nazir. That wasn't so complicated yet. Now we get to the complicated part. So we have so far, I just want to keep going with the structure of Rav. Rav made a statement, waving is essential. Then the Gemara said, according to who does this go? It doesn't make sense according to either opinion. Then we say it's essential here. Even in the chidush is it goes like Rabbi Eliezer, and it's essential because you might have thought it wasn't. Comes Rabbi Eliezer to say, it comes Rav to say that according to Rabbi Eliezer, it's essential. Okay, that's what Rav says. Now the Gemara wants to say, really? Umima akva, and they're going to bring a braita that I should say seems to contradict. So we're going to understand this braita in a few different ways. This is what's going to make it a little complicated. Anyway, starting now from Amud Bet. Umima akva, is it really essential, the waving? Hatanya, doesn't it say in a braita, Zot Torat Nazir, this is the process that the Nazir is supposed to do. Those words come to tell you, Ben sheyesh lo kapayim, ben she'en lo kapayim. Whether the person has hands or whether the person doesn't have hands, the rules are the same for both. Now, what does this teach you? Well, if you don't have hands, you can't wave. So the way they understand this braita now, and that's why I say specifically the way we're going to understand it now, because we'll see a bunch of different ways to understand this, is that if someone doesn't have hands, we assume that means they can't do the waving. If they can't do the waving, it seems like the rules are the same for them, meaning they can still finish the process of Nizirut even without it, okay? Since that's the case, that someone who doesn't have hands doesn't have to do the waving because they have no way to do the waving, well, we're going to say, because it says ben sheyesh lo ben she'en lo, we're going to learn from one to the other. Since misha en lo kapayim doesn't have to do the waving, even someone who has hands but didn't do the waving for whatever reason, it's okay. It's not an essential part. That's the way they understand it right now, which they're going to use as a question to say, maybe this is not, it seems clear from here, this is not an essential part. To which they say, you can't read that source that way because there's another source that has the exact same structure on a different topic, same topic of Nazir, but a different topic of someone who doesn't have something. And it's understood clearly there differently. Elahaditanya, zot Torah Nazir, ben sheyesh lo se'al, ben she'en lo se'al, hachinami de lo ma'akva. This is the rules for the Nazir, whether you have hair or whether you don't have hair. Are you trying to say that this means that if you don't have hair, so you don't have to shave, and therefore if you do have hair and you don't shave, it's not an essential part? That's what we would say if we understood it the same way we understood the braita. However, you can't possibly say this because of another braita. Hatanya Nazir memoat, a Nazir who doesn't have any hair, a bald Nazir. Beit Shammai omrim eino tzarich lahavir tal al rosho, which we'll understand soon what he means. but he doesn't need to put a razor over his head. Ubeit Hillel omrim, right now I'm just understanding it literally. We'll understand what he means in a minute or two. Ubeit Hillel omrim tzarich lahavir talach al rosho. What does Beit Hillel say? You need to put a razor over your head. You might have no hair, but you still need to do the action of shaving. Take a razor, put it over your bald head. So now let's go back and reinterpret that Braita. That Braita says, whether you have hair or whether you don't have hair, what does it mean? It means whether you have hair or whether you don't have hair, you still need to do the action. Okay? You still need, even though it's not done in the same way because you're not actually removing hair, but you still need to put a razor over your head. Now let's go back to our Braita. Whether you have hands or whether you don't have hands, and I see someone wrote this in the chat, you still have to do the waving. You just do it using your arms. So you don't have hands, you use your arms, okay? So you figure out a way to do it, even if it's not done in the ideal way it's supposed to be done, because it actually says in the Torah, al kapo, right? It says put him on his hands. You might have noticed that in the pasuk. It says put it on his hands specifically. If you don't have hands, so use something else, which means that don't question me. Is it ma'akev? Don't we learn that from there? No. Don't we learn from, we tried to learn from the Braita. It's not essential because look, even someone who doesn't have hands manages, right? And likewise, then someone who does have hands and didn't do it, it should be okay. No. You have to do it. You just do it in some other way, right? You have to shave your head. So you put a razor over your head, even though you have no hair. You have to do the waving and you use your arms. Somehow you use some other part of your body. Okay. So that is the answer to the question. So let's just, before we move on, get the structure really clear. Rav said, Snufa ben Nazir is ma'akva. Then we questioned, according to who does this go? It doesn't seem to match either approach. The question of Rabbi Eliezer was, isn't it obvious, according to Rabbi Eliezer? To which they said, it is Rabbi Eliezer. It wasn't so obvious. Even though he says, after all these actions, you might have still thought Snufa is a side thing. It's not a side thing, it's essential. To which the Gemara said, is it really essential? Doesn't this Braita prove that it's not essential? Someone who doesn't have hands sounds like he doesn't have to do the waving. Based on the Braita about the Nazir who has no hair, we proved, since Beit Hillel says there, you have to put a razor over your head, we proved that also the Nazir without hands has to do the tzufa, and therefore we've answered the question against Rav. We have one last thing to do in this version before we finish, which is, what does Beit Shammai say? What is their opinion? I told you, we didn't really understand yet. Beit Shammai says you don't need to put a razor over your head. What does that mean? It sounds like it means just skip the mitzvah. But that's not the way Ravina understands it. Amar Ravina, my einot sarich lebeit Shammai. Einot sarich, ein lo takana. Einot sarich means you can't put a razor over your head, and therefore you're stuck as a Nazir all your life. Someone who's bald, since you can't remove your hair, you became a Nazir, there's no way to get out of it. To which they say, and this, by the way, helps explain what we said before. Okay, this is actually still part of the explanation, because once we explain Beit Shammai, which means you can't, and therefore you're stuck forever. Beit Hillel yesh lo takana. From here you see, according to Beit Hillel, there is a way to do it, which is the way we explain Beit Hillel, which would then explain what we were trying to say, which is you still have to do it, right? You have to do it. Here's the way you do it. And therefore, same thing with the one without hands. Now they point out this side point, which we'll see in the second version. It's a totally different way of understanding. And this version of understanding the Beit Shammai Beit Hillel machloka, which we're going to understand differently in the next section, but right now we understand the machloka very simply. Beit Hillel says you need to do it, and there's no way to do it. In other words, einot sarich means there's no way out. Beit Hillel says, I agree, you need to do it. They both agree you need to do it. It's just Beit Hillel says, I have no problem. You might not have hair, but who cares? Do the action of putting a razor over your head and you're fine. So now they say this explanation of Beit Shammai fits perfectly with what Rabbi Pidat said, because Rabbi Pidat said, and this we see in many, many places where rabbis like to say, oh, by the way, this guy and this guy and this guy and that machlok and that guy and a different machlok, all are saying the same thing. So we take a machlok from somewhere else and we say the concept is exactly the same. Rabbi Pidat says that Beit Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer amru davar echad. This is not the opinion of Rabbi Eliezer that we saw before. This is a different, same Rabbi Eliezer, but a different opinion of his. My Rabbi Eliezer, what opinion of Rabbi Eliezer? Titania. If you remember with the Mitzorah has to have a process where they put blood on his right ear, on his right finger, and on his right toe. And they say, what do you do? Same question. Misha ein lo bohan yad v'regel. What if you don't have a toe or a hand? You don't have a finger, okay, or a toe on your right hand. Ein lo tahara olamit divrei Rabbi Eliezer. Here we're going to see three opinions. So Rabbi Eliezer says there's no way to ever get out of being a mitzora. This is a fascinating question in general. What do we do? This whole concept, what do we do if someone doesn't have, what's needed? Do we come up with some workaround, or are we stuck because we can't fulfill exactly the way it says it in the Torah? So Rabbi Eliezer and Beit Shammai match their opinion in general, right? About like the Beit Shammai, we always call it a shamuti type opinion. It's a very strict opinion of this is the way it's supposed to be done. You can't do it that way. You're stuck. So Rabbi Eliezer also says the same thing when it comes to a Mitzvah. So basically, Rabbi Padat, we could stop right here. Rabbi Padat is saying this is one and the same. By the leper, by the Nazir, it's both the same idea. The Torah says do something in a particular way. You can't do it in that way. You don't have a calf. You don't have a toe or a finger. So you're stuck. Okay, a right toe or a right finger. We're going to see three opinions here. Rabbi Shimon Omer, you put it where your finger is supposed to be. Okay, let's say you have a palm, you don't have fingers. So put it where the right finger is supposed to be and, basically improvise. Okay, put it on your arm if all you have is an arm. Okay, that's his opinion. Chachamim omrim, as you're suggesting, put it on your left hand. If you have a left hand, put it on your left hand. It's true the Torah said right hand, but okay, if you don't have right, put it on your left. So these two opinions come up with alternatives, which sounds like the Beit Hillel option of, okay, so you don't have any hair, but put the razor over your head. But Beit Shammai holds like the other. Anyway, this whole understanding of the Machlokes Beit Shammai matches Rabbi Padat, who basically put Beit Shammai in the same category as Rabbi Eliezer and the Machlokes about the leper. So again, let's just review the structure because now we're going to compare it to a new structure. Rav says Tufa Ma'akevet. The Gemara says, who does this accord with? It doesn't seem to fit with any. That's stage 2. Stage 3, they give an answer. Okay, stage 3, by the way, is going to be missing in the next section. We're just going to ask the question and not give an answer. Stage 4 is it really Ma'akev? Is Rav really right? Doesn't the Braita seem to go against that? To which they bring the Braita with the hair to say, no, it doesn't go against it because you misunderstood it. And they explain Beit Hillel as saying, you have to put a razor over your head. Okay, and that resolved the question. Now in the second version, we're going to start off the same. Amrela, some people say, okay, Lishana Achrina, different version. Amarav, and there's an aleph there which sends you to the Bach, which actually says maybe it's Rava. Okay, so maybe we change also who said it. Anyway, we're more concerned right now with the content. Shnufa ben Nazir ma'akevet. So first part, same exact thing. Okay, second stage is going to be almost the same thing. It's just the order is flipped. Okay, so second stage is aliba deman, according to who does Rav's opinion fit with, or Rabba's opinion. Ilema aliba de Rabbi Eliezer. So this time they start with Rabbi Eliezer. If you're going to say Rabbi Eliezer, pshita, it's obvious. Hama Rabbi Eliezer, Chama Sim Kulam. Rabbi Eliezer already said it's after everything, so Rav doesn't need to tell us anything. We already know that. Ela aliba de Rabbanan. Say it's like the rabbis. Also doesn't fit. If the shaving isn't so critical, Tnufa Mabaya, are you going to need to do the waving? Okay, so it doesn't seem to match either opinion, and they don't give an answer. Now, instead of questioning Rav, is it really Ma'akev based on the Braita, where we thought the Braita was saying it's not Ma'akev, now we're going to do the reverse. Now we're going to ask a question on the rabbis. We just brought up, and that's probably why they switched the order here, because they wanted to end with the rabbis as part of the question, then say, wait a minute. It's so obvious to the rabbis that it's not essential. Doesn't it seem from this Braita that it is essential? Omilo ma'akva, is it not? Ma'akev, is it not an essential part of the process? V'hatanya, zot Torah Nazir, ben sheyesh lo kapayim, uben she'en lo kapayim. This is what the Nazir has to do, whether you have hands or whether you don't have hands. Now I'm going to read this in a totally different way. Not me, but the Gemara. What this means is, what it did before is it said, just like someone who has no hands, and can do the process even without, right? I'm going back to the first way we read it, and can do it without, that seems like, because you don't have hands to do it with, right? That was the first way we understood it. Therefore, someone who does have hands seems like he can manage without. That's obviously not the way they're understanding it now, because that would work fine with the rabbis. Now we're saying, what we were doing was we're learning from someone she'ain to someone she'yesh. Now we're going to do the same thing, but in the reverse. Zot Torah Nazir is more of a declaration. It has to be done in this way. Whether you have hands or whether you don't have hands, meaning the rules are the same whether you have hands, whether you don't have hands. You don't have hands, you can't do it. You're stuck. These are the rules. This is what you have to keep. If you don't have hands and you can't do the waving, well, you'll never get out of being a Nazir, because these are the rules no matter who you are. which then would mean, obviously, if you have hands and you don't do the waving, of course, you're not going to get out of being a Nazir. So that's the way they understand it right now. So that raises a question on the rabbis, to which the Gemara is going to say, or by the way, you could say, I could say it a little differently, which is, even if you don't have hands, you still need to do it, meaning maybe not that you can't get out of it ever, but you can use your arms to do it, right? You have to do it in some way, no matter what. And therefore, ben sheyesh lo, obviously, if you have hands, well, you're going to obviously have to do it. Either which way, it seems to say it's obvious you have to do it. To which, what they're going to do now, I'll tell you just so you don't get lost in the structure. They're going to try to answer the question from the sugya of the hair, and then they're going to reject the way we read the sugya of the hair and say, no, you can't read it that way, and therefore they're rejecting the answer, and they're left with the question. We're going to, in the end, the sugya is left with two questions. First, they ask, who does Rav go like? And we don't know who. And then, how did the rabbis possibly say that this the waving is not essential? They're going to try to explain somehow that it's clear it's not, and then they're going to reject it, and they're going to be stuck with the question. Okay, so now they're going to say the following. You want to say ben sheyesh lo, ben she'en lo means you have to, okay, it's essential. Well, ha'detanya zot Torat Nazir ben sheyesh lo se'al ben she'en lo se'al hachinami dema'akava v'hatanya Nazir memorat bet Shammai omrim ein tzarich laver ta'al rosho bet Hillel omrim tzarich. Now, the way they understand this is the following. Beit Hillel, right now, they're understanding, like we did before, you have to put a razor over your head. So what they're trying to say is, when it says ben sheyesh lo, ben she'en lo, what it's really trying to tell you is not that ben sheyesh lo, ben she'en lo doesn't mean just like if you don't have it and you can't do it, you don't have to do it there, or just like if you have it and it's essential, you have to do it just like there, it's essential. No, it has nothing to do with, is this ma'akev, is it not ma'akev, or is this like that? No, what they're trying to say is very technical. Just like when you're a Nazir who has hair and you put a razor over your head, if you're a Nazir who doesn't have hair, you put a razor over your head. But it doesn't have anything to do with, is this essential or is it not? It's just prescribing, how do you do it? If you have hair, you put a razor over your head. Okay, if you don't have hair, you also put a razor over your head. Likewise, when it comes to the one who has hands or doesn't have hands. If you have hands, the way you wave is with your hands. If you don't have hands, the way you wave is as close as you can get, right? Put it on your arm, something like that. Which means that this doesn't teach you, though, is it essential, is it not essential? That's not the subject of this braita. Not in that place and not in that place. That's what they're trying to say right now. Which means that don't question the rabbis from that braita, which seems to indicate it's essential. No, that's not what the braita means. To which the Gemara says, this is confusing because we keep reading these sources in different manners. So it just makes it a little bit confusing. But it's not actually that confusing. It's just that we keep reading the same words in different manners, and we're going to do the same thing right now. So now they say, like I said, they're going to reject this answer. The answer was, okay, now let's get the answer clear. The answer was, it doesn't teach you anything about ma'akev, because what is it saying? When Beit Hillel says tzarich, the way we understood it previously, you have to just put a razor over your head. It's just telling you how to do it. Like I said, it's prescribing how it's supposed to be done, not telling you, though, it has to be done or doesn't have to be done. So now the Gemara says, wait a minute. Amal Rabbi Avina, might tzarich lebeit Hillel. Now all of a sudden we're going to say, Rabbi Avina is going to come and say, that doesn't prove anything. Okay, your answer is the wrong answer. Why is it the wrong answer? Because you misunderstood Beit Hillel. And now we're going to understand Beit Hillel totally differently than we understood him before. Before we understood, remember, it's very clear. Beit Shammai says there's no resolution. You have to put a tar ala rosh and you have no way to do it, so you're stuck. And Beit Hillel says, no, tzarich lavir tar ala rosho. Right, remember, Beit Hillel, I just want to get the language, okay? Beit Shammai said a no tzarich doesn't really mean you don't need to, but a no tzarich means you have no way to do it. It's not exactly the simple reading, but it means that's the way we understood it. You can't. You're stuck, just like the leper is stuck. That was the first way we read it. And Beit Hillel says tzarich means you just do the technical action, putting a razor over your head. But Rabbi Avina understands it totally different. Rabbi Avina says, "Might tzarich lebeit Hillel," and this comes up in a bunch of sugyot where it says tzarich, and it means tzarich ve'en lo takana. You need to shave your head, but you don't have any hair to shave, so you are stuck. In this case, it's Beit Hillel who thinks you're stuck, according to Rabbi Avina. Okay, this is again, we're taking the exact same source. We're just explaining it totally differently. And okay, so now, ha lebeit Shammai yesh lo takana upliga de Rabbi Padat. And then they point out that according to him, Beit Shammai says a yot tzarich, meaning you don't need to shave your head. You don't have hair, so you don't need to shave your head. And therefore, he disagrees with Rabbi Padat's understanding of this machlok. So again, Rabbi Padat said, Beit Shammai and Rabbi Eliezer say the same thing. In this case, it would be Beit Hillel and Rabbi Eliezer who say the same thing, because it's Beit Hillel who thinks there's no takanah. How did this work in? Because we probably got lost with the flow. Okay, what did we do? Let's just go back. Rav said, or Rava said, ma'akev, right? We said, who does it go by? We really can't figure it out. We left that question aside. Went to question number 2, which we're also not going to have an answer for. Question number 2 is on the rabbis, not on Rav. It's on the rabbis. The rabbis think that shaving is not essential. Doesn't it say in this Braita that, bein sheyesh lo, bein she'ein lo, which would seem to indicate if you don't have, you have to do it anyway, and it's ma'akev. Okay, that's how they understood it. To which they said, no, you can't understand it that way, because look at the bein sheyesh lo, bein she'ein lo by se'ar. By the hair, Beit Hillel says, you just put a razor over your head, and that's what that whole thing is coming to teach you. You do it, again, the reading of that Braita is not that we're comparing one to the other, it's you do it in the same manner, right? And by the way, some commentaries point out that what you're really doing is you're, instead of comparing and saying, just like the first way we read it was, just like one who doesn't have has to do it anyway, right? Does it in some way. Likewise, one who does have, or the reverse, just like someone who doesn't have, we tried to say, doesn't need to do it. Likewise, the one who has and doesn't do it doesn't need to. That was how we understood it in the first place. It was saying we're going to learn from Misha'ein lo to Mishayesh lo. This is the opposite. We're going to learn from the one who does it. If you have hair, you put a razor. If you don't have hair, you also put a razor. You do it in the same manner. That was how they tried to answer the question. But they rejected that because they said that's not what Beit Hillel says. Beit Hillel doesn't mean you have to do it in the same manner. Beit Hillel says no. You need to shave. You need to, but you can't. Okay, why can't you? Because Beit Hillel is saying, in other words, Nazir, the tiglachat, the shaving is essential. Now go back and read the one about the hands. That means tenufat is essential, right? That's their whole idea. And since you don't have hands, you can't do it. Since you don't have hair, you can't do it, and you're stuck. So according to this, we're back to square one with our question on the rabbis. If Beit Hillel says it's essential, because we don't care about Beit Shammai, we're in Beit Hillel, we always go by Beit Hillel. Since Beit Hillel says it's essential, how can you possibly say it's not essential? And we're left with that question. Okay, so in the first version, we answered all our questions. We said Rav holds like Rabbi Eliezer, and there is a chiddush. Don't think it's obvious; it's not so obvious. Because normally, right, the waving is a shiur mitzvah. It's an extra. It's not the main thing. Here, it's essential. And then try to question from those braitas. Oh no, Beit Hillel says you have to shave. You have to put a razor over your head, and therefore it would show. Now, the way they understood it then, right, that it is essential. And that we're going to learn from one to the other that you have to do it. You just do it in this way. Likewise, the Nazir who doesn't have hands has to do it. And just like the Nazir who has to do it, also the Nazir who doesn't have to do it, right? Also just like one who doesn't have hands still has to, also one who does have hands would still have to. And then, right, which is basically in essence, the way we understand it at the end here also. You have to do it, and therefore it questions the rabbis, because the rabbis seem to think you don't have to do it. And this really seems to indicate you have to do it. Okay, so there we had two different versions of how to read this, where in the second, we were left with both questions. Okay, now, and obviously, this is a whole interesting approach to what do we do when we can't fulfill the Torah exactly as it says, right? It's a very important question. And you see here, as usual, there are multiple approaches, right? Especially in the leper, where we even had 3 approaches to how to do it. And in this case, we have not only different approaches, but different opinions about the approaches, who holds what, and what, right, and what those opinions are. So which just shows how, I guess, complicated topic this is, as we know, and how people dealt with it. Who says what is a very important question. It's not just, okay, who said what? It's, we follow Beit Hillel in general, so which one do we follow here? It's a very interesting question. Okay, next, Mishnah. Okay, before we read this Mishnah, the first thing to remember is we learned that you're supposed to do one of the sacrifices and then shave your hair, at least, right? At least one has to be done before. There was a debate. Should it be ideally the shlamim and then shave your hair, or the chatat, the sin offering, and then shave your hair? But everyone agreed that you have to do one sacrifice and then shave your hair, right? They all agreed that if you did any one of the three, it really doesn't. In the end, all of them work, okay? And then you shave your hair. But what happens if you shave your hair first, before you do any sacrifices? If you shave your hair first, then your shaving is basically considered, even though you finished your 30 days of Nizirut, it cancels your Nizirut basically. Because, in other words, again, when you shave, it's like cutting your hair in the middle of your Nizirut, which basically is useless, meaningless. First of all, it's forbidden. And you have to grow it another 30 days in order that when you do your sacrifices, you can do a shaving of 30 days worth of hair growth. So this is just before we get to the Mishnah, it's very obvious that if you did sacrifice shaving, you're good. If you do shaving sacrifice, you're messed up. You can't do, your sacrifice is meaningless. You have to wait 30 days to start. It's no good. You cannot shave before you do. What if, here comes the what if question. So that sounds pretty good. Okay, you brought the sacrifice, you shaved, so far so good. But then it turns out your sacrifice was disqualified. First of all, we saw that you could do the shlamim, you shech the shlamim, you just do the slaughtering, and then you can already shave. But what if the Kohen on his way to bring the blood to the altar spills the blood, somebody bumps into him, knocks the blood over, you're done. Your sacrifice is no good. That's sprinkling the blood, it's disqualified. So in the end, retroactively, you ended up becoming, right? There's all sorts of ways your sacrifice could be disqualified. I'm not going to get into all of them right now, but the point is you could retroactively, it turns out your shaving was done before your sacrifices. So now you're stuck. If you brought all three sacrifices after that, it's as if you did nothing, because it's as if you shaved before you brought sacrifices. Now we're going to talk about some other disqualifications. And for this, you need to know some basic rules about a korban shelo lishma. We talked about this not so long ago. Korban shelo lishma is while I'm the Kohen, let's say slaughtering, or even any regular person can slaughter. I'm slaughtering, even though usually the Kohanim did it. I'm slaughtering my animal, okay, my sin offering. But I have in mind that I'm doing the shlamim. I get confused, okay? I'm slaughtering my peace offering, and I have in mind that I'm doing the burnt offering. So there's different rules. Generally, a korban shelo lishma for most sacrifices, other than two exceptions, one of them is the sin offering. If I do it shelo lishma, since I can bring the offering voluntarily if I wanted, like shlamim and ola, so what do? I go ahead and I bring the offering anyway. But if, let's say, it was a shlamim or an ola for my Nazirite term, it doesn't count for what I did. I'll have to replace it with a different shlamim or ola sacrifice. But I do go ahead and bring the rest of the sacrifice. However, if it's a sin offering that was done with the wrong intent, I'm stuck. It's completely disqualified, and basically that animal cannot be brought on the altar. Okay, so there's a difference. One is disqualified, one is not disqualified, but either which way, none of them count for what I was meaning to count for. So now you're going to see why this is relevant. Let's say I did it on the chatat. I shaved, I did the sacrifice, I shaved, and then I realized, oh no, it had the wrong intent, or the Kohen had the wrong intent. And then I brought my shlamim, my ola perfectly right, well. So since the chatat is totally disqualified, nothing worked. Okay, I'm back to square one. It's the same thing. Okay, so now what if I did it to the ola or the shlamim, and then I continued and brought whichever other ones were left? Because remember, chatat, ola, and shlamim. Same thing. Why same thing? Because who cares that at the end I could bring my ola, I could bring my shlamim. When I bring them as voluntary offerings, and that's not what my tiglacha, my shaving had to be on, the offering for the Nazir. And in the end, that wasn't an offering for a Nazir because I messed it up. But Rabbi Shimon disagrees about this last point. Rabbi Shimon omer, oto hazevach lo alalo, aval shar zvachim alulo. That sacrifice didn't count, but the other zvachim did, meaning my shaving worked. Okay, so let's say I do a shlamim with the intent that it was an ola. So that shlamim is brought as a voluntary offering. I did my shlamim, I shaved, then I brought the ola and the chata perfectly well. So my ola and chata count, my shaving counts, because that sacrifice was never completely disqualified. Chatat, it wouldn't work for, but for a shlamim or an ola, since it works as a nedava, that worked for my shaving. Okay, in a minute, the Gemara is going to infer something from this about shalmei nedava. We'll get to that in a minute. Last case, and this is agreed upon by everybody, in gilach al shloshtan. Let's say I did chatat ola shlamim, and then I shaved at the end of all three. And nimtza chad mehem kasher, and it turns out one of the three was disqualified, obviously, tiglachatok shera, because it was still done after one perfect sacrifice, maybe two, and yavishar zvachim, and whichever ones were disqualified, I'll have to just bring again, but my shaving is perfectly fine. I don't have to wait the extra 30 days. So we saw all different kinds of issues where if I shaved and the only one I shaved for was disqualified, according to the Tanakama, in every case, it's not going to be good. I'm going to have to wait 30 days and none of my sacrifices I brought after are relevant at all. I have to start all over again. But according to Rabbi Shimon, he made this one distinction with an Ola and a Shlamim. Ola and Shlamim that were done Shalom Lishma. Since they're not disqualified, if I shaved after that, anything I did after is fine. I just have to re-bring that sacrifice that was disqualified. So Amar Rav Bar Ava Zot Omeret, and this is the last thing for today. From here we can infer that Kasava Rabbi Shimon Nazir shegilach al shalmei davar yatsa. From here you can infer, since basically we're going to do a mathematical equation here. Shlamim shalo lishma is equal to shalmei davar. It's basically, right, a shlamim of a Nazir, a peace offering of a Nazir that you did with the wrong intent, basically is brought to the temple like any voluntary shlamim offering. From here we learn that if you bring a voluntary shlamim offering to the temple on the day you're supposed to finish your nizirut, and you shave after that, and then you bring your 3 Nazir sacrifices, it's actually effective, because that's basically what he's saying here. My timer, so now where on earth could he get this from? It seems a little bit strange. Damar Krai says I could get it from the pasuk. He doesn't say this, but the Gemara tells us, V'natan al ha'esh asher tachat zevach hashlamim. Okay, this is, by the way, this is a good, again, a little promo for Rabbanit Michelle Farber Shiur, which is going on Sundays now. This week she's talking about the Stam Gemara. It's when the Stam Gemara, it's the anonymous element in the Gemara, which basically puts words in the words of Tanaim sometimes. Okay, so here we're basically saying this is what Rabbi Shimon would say, even though he's not here. But the Stam Gemara is saying, well, where can he get this from? And they insert this pasuk. We don't really know if that's what he said, but the Stam Gemara comes and says, we know where he's getting this from. Remember, you put the hair underneath the fire with the shlamim burning. V'lo katav shlamav. Doesn't say on his shlamim offering. It says on the zevach of the peace offerings, which, first of all, it's in plural, peace offerings. It seems to include any peace offering. If you do the shaving with any peace offering, even a voluntary one, it will be sufficient. Again, this is only according to Rabbi Shimon. The rabbis obviously think no way, no how. So quick summary of our daf, and with that we'll finish. We started with this machloket about, is it all the actions have to happen to finish your nizirut or just one sacrifice? We showed what's the source of the one sacrifice. It's from this Gzera Shava. Then we had this more complicated sugya of Rav, which had 2 different versions of it. And each version might have the same question asked. One, they answered the question, the other, they didn't answer the question. And then we questioned in the first version, is it really true that it's ma'akev based on this braita, and then brought the hair braita to say that's not the way we understood the braita. Then that answered the question. Then we brought in the second version, is it really, how do the rabbis say it's not ma'akev? It must be essential. Look at this braita, and they understood the braita we brought before about the no hands in a totally opposite manner. And then they brought the hair in a way to try to answer the question, but then said, no, that's not the way to understand that. And we really end up with no answer to the rabbis. And then within that, there was this machloket about how to understand Beit Hillel, Beit Shammai machloket. What does each of them say? Because it wasn't so clear from their words. And then we got to this whole issue of if you shaved over a sacrifice that was disqualified, then basically your shaving is irrelevant unless you did some other sacrifice that was good beforehand. And then we had the debate about the shlamim or ola shalom lishma between Rabbi Shimon and the rabbis. And then we saw the source. Where does Rabbi Shimon get it from? And already tomorrow, new Mishnah. Wishing everybody a Shabbat Shalom.